Please welcome Ms. Steinman.
Are we having a good time tonight or what? I've rarely been in a room with so much energy and good ideas and great hearts and good minds. The only thing that worries me is that everyone who comes up to the table tells me such a great story about what's happened to them. And I wonder if you're telling each other. I mean, it's clear to me that I'm just an excuse for you to get together and discover you didn't need me in the first place. So you have to promise me that you'll look around the room and see 3 or 4 people you don't know and introduce yourselves and say what you care about and what you're doing. You'll leave here with a new revolutionary colleague, a new job, a new love affair. I mean, who knows what might happen? Really, this is an incredible room full of energy. And I am very, very happy to be here on the more sane part of the subcontinent that I share with you. I feel that, especially after our election. I'm so sorry that you have this terrible backwash of television on. However, we did get you a better neighbor. We elected a better neighbor. Right, Barack Obama. I'm especially happy to be here for and with the YWCA. I think of all the organizations I know in this world, I have the most respect for the YW. If there were one group to rule the world, it should be the YWCA. And I'm especially honored to be here with Premier Redford. I've never been able to say Premier before a woman's name before. You can imagine how excited I am. I'm so proud to see her honored in her own country and so impressed with her knowledge and effectiveness and compassion and work in other countries, from Bosnia to Afghanistan to Vietnam to South Africa. Maybe you could lend her to us, do you think? Is that a possibility? No. Right. And her ex-husband led her transition team. Now, is that impressive or what? Is that... And I also love the subject of this evening, which is whispering. That's a genius theme, because so many of us whisper truths that we should be saying out loud. It's such an indicator of the constraints that are inside us, our worry about approval, and what we can and cannot say. I have to say, it also reminds me of my mother, who was a wonderful, loving, open, admirable person. But in her era, even though my father was Jewish, she would always say about someone, "Is he Jewish?" Or about a particular man I was going out with who was not a white person, she would say, "Is he very dark?" So I think it's a great indicator, and it's a great subject. And what it says, especially in this context, because there's so many people here speaking for women especially who cannot speak for themselves, that you know how to listen. And there is no act more revolutionary than listening. So I thank you for that. And I just want to say that I think some of our whispering which of course has to do with domestic violence, with all kinds of things we find unacceptable, is also an image we might extend to other things, for instance, to history. There's so much that we have not known about our history, about how it was that Native nations were treated by both of our countries and arriving Europeans, and when we started to learn history at all. Why did we not start earlier? After all, in the earlier times, in original cultures, there were matrilineal cultures that really were modeled on the circle, not the pyramid. My friends from Indian country in the United States, women in the women's movement, always say, what did Christopher Columbus call primitive? Equal women. And because we don't know, then we find that loss of memory is the source of oppression, because we think that what we don't know is not possible, and we take what we know for human nature. Just recently, there was a first conference in Israel last week, the first ever historical conference about the sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust. For 70 years, that has been whispered and not studied and not widely admitted. There is an anthology newly out by Sonia Hedgepeth and Rochelle Seidel with many reminiscences, many documented cases within that anthology. And yet, even in the case of Nuremberg, it was not admitted as evidence. It was whispered, but never understood. Now that these stories are beginning to be told, they have made a path out of despair and shame for women who were sexually assaulted in Bosnia, in the Congo, in so many war-torn countries, as we see now. And there has finally, because we've stopped whispering, become, as of last month, a brand new way of documenting sexual abuse, which is crowdsourcing. Thanks to technology, it's possible. So you see how very far we've come, but also how far we have to go. I suppose for us in this room, the most frequent source of whispering is domestic violence. You know, in my country, we looked at the FBI statistics, and we discovered that if you counted from 9/11 to now, that the number of women murdered by their husbands or boyfriends since 9/11 exceeded all of the people killed in 9/11, all of the Americans killed in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. And yet we somehow treat this as a different form of violence. We imagine that we need more proof, or that it's okay for the victim to be put out of her house and the criminal to stay in the house. And I know that here in this community, you have recently had 2 murder-suicides of exactly this kind. But I think we need to take one more step away from whispering by explaining that this violence is not isolated or discrete, that actually domestic violence perhaps should be called original violence, because it is so much the force that normalizes violence for us in our childhoods, in our lives, that makes us feel that there is no alternative. If we have experienced it, Gender roles may make us express it differently as we grow up, and the masculine role may cause us to abuse other people. The feminine role may cause us to continue to be abused, but the fact is that the source is the same. Once I spent a month or two reading about the backgrounds of especially brutal dictators in this world. Saddam Hussein, Ceausescu in Romania, Stalin, Hitler himself, and every single one of them was brutally, systematically, daily humiliated and tortured as a child. And what that does, I think, is to make us feel deeply there are only two choices: to be the victim of the victimizer. Yes, gender roles make us choose one or the other, but the source and the problem is truly the same. This is not an excuse for behavior, because so many people are able to recover and dig out this violence, and indeed only about 30% of people who experience violence in their childhoods repeat it, as far as we know. It is not an excuse, but it is a reason. It is a reason. And we have yet to take it to that level of depth, to see it, I think, as a part of our overall political and social fabric. This also, as far as we know, did not exist in original cultures, whether it was here or the Khoi or the San in South Africa or the Dalits in India, because patriarchy did not exist, because it was not matriarchal, which is a misnomer, I think. We can't imagine that someone is not leading, so we imagine that women just replaced men, which was not the point. It was matrilineal. But women did control their own fertility, and the idea that patriarchy decided when and whether women should have children, to whom those children belonged, had not yet come along. And that not yet was only on this continent 500 or 600 years ago, nowhere in the world maybe more than 5,000 years ago. So for 95% of human history, we live differently. And somehow that gives me hope. I think that the idea that what we are seeing as human nature is the most oppressive, that there is no choice. In fact, there is choice, and there's choice and different kinds of cultures we can learn about. And why did all this violence come about? Gradually, to control reproduction. If women's bodies were not the most basic means of production, the means of reproduction, this would not be happening. In order to control how many workers, how many soldiers, who they belong to in patriarchal systems, in order to continue racist structures, you have to be able to influence what groups continue and what do not. So women of the so-called superior group are isolated, so they will keep the superior group pure, and women of the so-called inferior group are exploited, so they will produce more people marked on their skins as cheap labor. I think the intertwining of racism and sexism is so clear. I think we know it. And yet our movements are still sometimes thought of as separate or in silos, when in fact it's not possible to be a feminist and not be an anti-racist, and it's not possible to defeat racism without also attacking sexism. It's simply not possible. Of course, there's also a division sometimes between us and between the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement, which also makes no sense. Sometimes on campuses where I speak a lot, young people will say to me, "Why is it that the same groups are against birth control and lesbians?" But obviously, it makes sense because the same groups are against any form of sexual expression that cannot end in conception. So naturally, they're against women's ability to control our own reproductive lives and decide whether and when to have children, which incidentally is the single greatest element in whether we're healthy or not, educated or not, working outside the home or not, and how long we live. It's our health concern to achieve reproductive freedom as a fundamental human right, like freedom of speech